The wind had teeth and it was chewing on the world, spitting dust and grit against the cabin walls. It was a sound Elias knew better than his own name. The sound of solitude. Then came another. A knock. Faint, desperate, almost swallowed by the gale. He froze, the worn leather of his armchair creaking in the sudden stillness of his body. No one came out this far. No one ever came. He opened the door to a ghost sculpted from dust and desperation. A woman, her face a mask of cracked earth, clutched a bundle of rags that whimpered with the frail life of a child. Her eyes, hollowed out by hunger, met his. They were terrifying in their clarity, stripped of everything but a single, brutal purpose. She spoke, her voice a raw scrape, the words carried on a gust of wind that chilled him deeper than the storm. "Make me yours," she said, her gaze unwavering, offering the only currency she had left. "But feed my child." The sentence hung in the air between them, heavier than stone, an anchor of shame and survival. Elias felt a phantom pain in his chest, the echo of a loss so old it had become a part of his bones. He saw not one ghost, but three, the woman, the child, and the spectre of his own wife, his own son, taken by a fever that had burned through his world and left only ashes. He didn't answer. He couldn't. He simply stepped back, holding the door open. A silent invitation. An act that would unravel the tightly wound spool of his grief, thread by painful thread. She moved across the threshold like a wraith, a whisper of movement, leaving the roaring chaos of the storm outside. The door thumped shut, and the silence that rushed in was deafening. It had a pulse. Inside the sparse cabin, the dim lantern light cast long, dancing shadows. The woman, whose name he still didn't know, sank to the floor, her body folding around the small, whimpering bundle. She did not look at him. Her focus was absolute, a fierce and primal magnet pulling all of her being toward the child. Elias stood by the hearth, a stranger in his own home. Her proposal echoed in the room, a profane prayer born of utter hopelessness. "Make me yours." He felt a cold dread, not of her, but of himself. Of the man he might have been, the man who might have accepted such a terrible bargain. He saw the child's pallid face, the blue tint to his lips. He turned and walked to the small pantry, a space more defined by what it lacked than what it held. There, on a rough-hewn shelf, sat a single, dense loaf of dark bread. His last. The food meant to last him until the storm broke, until he could get to town. He held it in his calloused hands, the weight of it familiar, comforting. It was survival. It was certainty. He thought of the gnawing hunger he'd felt after the fever took his family, a hunger that had nothing to do with food. A hunger of the soul. He broke the loaf in two. The sound was a sharp crack in the quiet room, a declaration. He walked back, knelt, and held out half. Their eyes met for the second time. His were not the eyes of a buyer. Hers were not the eyes of the sold. "Eat," he said. The word was gravelly, unused. It was not a command. It was a plea of its own. The storm passed, leaving the world washed clean and raw. The days that followed were measured not in hours, but in silences. A thick, watchful quiet settled over the ranch, a language understood by all three occupants. Elias rose with the sun, his life a litany of hard-bitten chores, mending fences the wind had savaged, hauling water from the deep well, tending to the lean, hardy cattle that were his only companions. At first, the woman, he learned her name was Lena, stayed inside, a shadow in the corner of his eye. But then, slowly, she began to emerge. He would return from the fields to find a split log added to the woodpile. A torn shirt, left on a nail, would be mended with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She moved with a quiet efficiency, never asking, simply doing. She possessed a dignity that defied her circumstance, a resilience that was as stark and beautiful as the landscape itself. He found himself watching her hands as she worked in the small vegetable patch he had long neglected. They were strong, capable hands. He realized he was not her keeper, and she was not his burden. They were two solitary creatures orbiting a shared sun of survival, finding a strange gravity in their mutual respect. The transactional horror of her initial plea began to fade, replaced by the simple, undeniable truth of their shared existence. They were just people, trying to live. And in that quiet observation, a forgotten corner of his heart began to thaw. The child's name was Samuel. As the color returned to his cheeks, a spark of life returned to the dusty corners of the ranch. At first, he was a silent observer, his large, dark eyes tracking Elias's every move. He was a constant, aching reminder of the small boy Elias had lost, a ghost made of flesh and blood. The pain was so sharp that Elias kept his distance, his grief a wall between them. He would work, pretending not to notice the small figure trailing him from a safe distance, a tiny shadow mimicking his every move. One afternoon, while mending a harness in the barn, Elias found a forgotten block of soft pine. Without thinking, his hands began to move, the blade of his knife peeling back layers of wood, his mind lost in the muscle memory of a happier time. An hour later, a small, imperfect horse lay in his palm. He sanded it smooth with a piece of worn leather, its form simple but true. He left it on the porch rail that evening and walked away without looking back. The next morning, he saw Samuel clutching the wooden horse, his small hand wrapped tight around the carving. The boy looked up at him from across the yard, and for the first time, he smiled. A brilliant, gap-toothed, sun-drenched smile. It struck Elias like a physical blow, breaking through the wall of his sorrow with the force of a revelation. Lena stood in the doorway, and when his eyes met hers, he saw not just gratitude, but a profound understanding. A silent acknowledgement that he hadn't just carved a toy, he had offered a piece of his own broken heart. The pantry was bare again. The trip to town was a necessity, a journey into a world Elias had long kept at arm's length. With Lena sitting silently on the wagon bench and Samuel nestled between them, he felt a strange mix of apprehension and something he couldn't name. Protection, maybe. In the dusty main street of Redemption, a town that rarely lived up to its name, the stares began. They were sharp and venomous, glances that appraised, judged, and condemned in a single, flickering moment. Whispers followed them like flies. That's when he saw Harker. Silas Harker was a man whose wealth had been inherited and whose authority was self-appointed. He stood on the porch of the general store, flanked by two men who mirrored his smug posture. Harker's eyes landed on Lena, a predatory gleam in them, before shifting to Elias. He smiled, a greasy, knowing smirk. "Well, Elias," Harker's voice boomed, loud enough for the whole street to hear. "Didn't take you for the type to be collecting strays. Or is she paying for her keep?" The words were a slap, crude and deliberate. A wave of hot, white anger surged through Elias, a feeling he hadn't felt in years. He stopped the wagon. The street went quiet. He didn't speak. He simply met Harker's gaze, his eyes turning to cold, grey stone. There was no fear in them, no shame. Only a flat, dangerous calm. After a long, stretched-out moment, Elias clicked the reins and the wagon rolled forward, leaving Harker standing in a silence of his own making, his public humiliation simmering into a private rage. Shame, when it finds a home in a prideful man, festers into something ugly. Harker's public shaming became the town's quiet obsession. He saw Elias's dignified silence not as restraint, but as a direct challenge to his standing. Elias, the hermit, the ghost of the valley, had brought outsiders in. He had defied the unspoken code that shunned the desperate and the unknown. Harker began to poison the well of public opinion, his whispers slithering through the town. "A vagrant woman who knows what diseases they carry is putting us all at risk. Fear is a weed that grows fast in barren soil, and the town was barren of compassion." Elias felt the change. He saw it in the shopkeeper who now refused to meet his eye, in the way old neighbors would cross the street to avoid him. The animosity was a physical thing, a pressure building against the borders of his land. He wasn't just a recluse anymore, he was a pariah. One evening, he checked the latch on his cabin door, testing its strength. He ran a whetstone along the edge of his old axe, not with the intent of using it on a man, but because the ritual of sharpening steel sharpened his own resolve. He was no longer just protecting himself from loneliness. He was protecting a life that was not his own. He was protecting a fragile, budding hope. He was preparing for a storm made of men. The growl of an engine tore through the evening quiet, a sound of violation in the tranquil dusk. Headlights sliced through the twilight, pinning the small cabin in their glare. A truck, laden with the boisterous anger of 3 men, skidded to a halt in the yard. Harker swung himself out of the driver's seat, his face flushed with whiskey and righteous fury. He was evil with an audience. "Elias," he bellowed, his voice a blunt instrument. "We're here to clean up your mess." Lena pulled Samuel behind her, her body a shield. Elias stepped out onto the porch, moving with a deliberate, unhurried calm that infuriated Harker even more. He let the screen door slap shut behind him. The sound was like a gunshot in the tense air. "She's a whore, Elias." "A leech." "And you're a fool for letting her kind onto your land," Harker spat, jabbing a finger toward the cabin. "We're here to escort them out." For the good of the community, Elias's face was a mask carved from shadow and moonlight. He didn't speak. He simply descended the 3 porch steps and stood on the packed earth of his yard, planting himself between Harker's rage and the 2 souls behind him. He was a wall. A boundary. He had spent years letting the world crumble around him, but he would not let it crumble them. "Get out of the way, old man," Harker snarled, shoving Elias in the chest. It was a mistake. Shoving Elias was like shoving an old-growth oak. He didn't budge. Instead, all the years of silent grief, of repressed rage, of solitary struggle, coalesced into a single, kinetic moment. When Harker drew back his fist, Elias moved. He was not a young man, but his body was forged from a lifetime of hard labor. He moved with a brutal economy, a survivalist's grace. He deflected Harker's clumsy punch and drove his own fist, hard and knotted as a burl of wood, into the man's gut. The air left Harker in a whoosh. One of his cronies lunged, and Elias met him with a shoulder, sending him stumbling back into the truck's fender. It wasn't a fight, it was an expulsion. A raw, physical act of will. Harker, gasping, came at him again, blind with fury. Elias sidestepped and sent him sprawling into the dust he so despised. He stood over the man, his chest heaving, his heart pounding like a war drum. He was a specter of righteous anger, his shadow long in the truck's headlights. He looked down at the humiliated bully. "Leave," he said. The single word was not a request. It was a verdict. It was the sound of a border being drawn, of a sanctuary being declared. The other 2 men, their courage evaporating, dragged a sputtering Harker to his feet and bundled him back into the truck. The engine roared to life, and they fled, leaving only a cloud of dust and a profound, ringing silence. In the aftermath of the violence, the silence that fell was different. It wasn't the hollow quiet of loneliness or the tense quiet of anticipation. It was the deep, breathing silence of a sanctuary defended, of a storm that had finally broken. Elias stood in the yard for a long time, the adrenaline slowly seeping out of him, leaving a bone-deep weariness in its place. The screen door creaked open. Lena emerged from the shadows of the porch, a wet cloth in her hand. She approached him without a word, her movements fluid and certain. She gently took his chin in her hand and began to clean a small cut on his cheekbone, her touch as soft as a prayer. In that simple, intimate gesture, years of unspoken pain were acknowledged and absolved. It was an act of profound care, a mending of more than just skin. He looked into her eyes, and for the first time, he saw no fear, no desperation, no trace of the ghost who had appeared at his door. He saw Lena. Strong. Resilient. Whole. He saw a partner. From behind the door, Samuel peered out, his small wooden horse clutched in his fist. Elias looked from the woman to the child, and a feeling he thought long dead bloomed in his chest. A smile, genuine and unburdened, finally found its way to his lips. He understood then. He hadn't bought her. He hadn't saved her. He had simply made room. And in doing so, they had, all 3 of them, saved each other. The seasons turned, painting the valley in strokes of ochre, then white, then brilliant green. The cabin was no longer a monument to a man's grief but the bustling, breathing heart of a family. A family forged not by vows or by blood, but by the shared crumbs of a last loaf of bread. Elias would watch Lena in the garden she had brought back to vibrant life, her laughter a sound that had chased the last of the ghosts from the corners of his home. He would watch Samuel, growing tall and strong, running through the fields with a freedom Elias had never known. He was a rancher, a protector, a father, a husband. He had been given a second chance not at the life he had lost, but at a new one, richer and more profound for the sorrow that had preceded it. He had learned that a heart is not a fortress to be defended, but a field to be cultivated. You must break the soil to let the seeds grow. And now, as his story ends, the narrator turns the page and looks at you. Really looks at you. What is your last loaf of bread? What is the one thing you cling to, the thing you believe you cannot possibly share? Your time? Your trust? The carefully constructed wall around your heart? You guard it, convinced that sharing it means starvation, that giving it away means your own demise. But here is the secret of the rancher, the truth of the survivor, the lesson of the child. Break it. Share it anyway. Give it freely, with no expectation of return. And then, just watch. See what grows in its place. You might just find it is a feast that will feed you for the rest of your life.